like the most quick, fast, and dirty lesson on saving seeds as possible. So it's going to be a lot of information really quick, but we'll give you probably some more questions, but we'll hopefully allow you to kind of feel a little bit more confident to just jump into saving some seeds this year. Okay, so just no. Okay, so first things first, I just want to explain is how a flower structure actually works. And a lot of people know this, a lot of people don't, but there are things that are called perfect flowers and things imperfect flowers. I don't think it's really great terminology myself, but a perfect flower actually self-pollinates. So on the left-hand side here, we have what is called a perfect flower, and those purple things called the anthers are actually what release pollen. So a human comparison would be sperm, and in the plant world is pollen. And what happens is the pollen goes up in the air or is collected by insects and goes down what is called the stigma and into the style and goes down into the ovary. And it's in that ovary that the pollen pollinates the plant, and that is where the seed is produced. Very similar to human procreation, but in the plant kingdom. And so an imperfect flower is one that is either male or female, and the pollen has to travel from one flower to the next. So depending on what you're growing, you may have perfect flowers or imperfect flowers. Again, I don't like the terminology, but it is what the science community has labeled it. It's all going to make sense. All these pieces are important. So in vegetables and in perennial flowers, there are either annual seeds or biennial seeds. And so the concept of an annual seed is that the life cycle of the plant will actually produce seeds in one season, whereas a biennial plant will only produce seeds after the plant is grown for its fruit, goes through what's called a vernalization period, so it goes through a cold period, and then after it goes through a cold period, it will force itself into a flowering stage. So it's called a biennial because we can only grow them once every 2 years in our climate. So examples of biennials are things like brassicas, so broccoli, cauliflower, kohlrabi, kale, carrots, beets, things like that. Examples of annuals are tomatoes, cucumbers, beans, and things like that. People who are new to seed saving tend to start with annuals because they're really accessible and easy. And when you have places to store biennials, you can start experimenting with biennial seed production. There's 2 different ways you can overwinter biennials if you're really interested in that. So there's in the ground or there's in cold storage. There are a lot of challenges in our climate with overwintering in the ground because sometimes it will reduce your chances of it surviving the winter just based on our very, very cold winters. If we have a very good snow cover and while the plant is still alive, it can last, but if you're really serious about it, storing things in cold storage can be really successful, and I would recommend trying in cold storage first if you're going to try it. So isolation and pollination and genetic preservation. So as I was going back to those flowers, there are 3 different types of seeds or vegetable-producing plants, and they're usually distinguished by the type of pollination it requires for that whole fertilization process that we talked about in the flowers to happen. So there's the selfers, which are those perfect flowers, and then there are insect-pollinated plants, which require insects to transfer that pollen from the male flowers to the female flowers. And then there are wind-pollinated plants, which actually, they produce such an excess of pollen that they actually blow it up in the wind, and there's so much pollen it travels through wind to those other plants. And so it's important to distinguish and know what kind of plants you're growing and how much isolation they require if you want to keep a variety pure. It's really easy if something it self-pollinates, because it's like you can grow a lot of those plants in a short area, close area, whereas when you have insect pollination, however far an insect will travel, could possibly move pollen from one plant to another plant. So that has to be taken into mind. There's I've seen a lot of people walking around today with the How to Save Seeds book, which was sold at the front desk. It covers all of this stuff in a really great basic way, so I encourage people who want to learn more to check that out. And I have a number of other resources I will recommend too. But based on what you are growing, I'll make a caveat. If you want to keep a variety pure, so for example, if you want a brandywine tomato to stay to be a brandywine tomato, or you want your pumpkin to stay being a pumpkin, you want to take into consideration isolation distances so that your pumpkin doesn't cross with your zucchini, and then the next generation you get like this pumpzini, right? Or something. So if you want to keep a variety pure, then you have to take into consideration these isolation distances, which are recommended. My slides are going faster than I am. If you want to play around and breed new varieties and try cool stuff, you can also just abandon all this and just see what happens. But if you want to keep varieties pure, learning about the isolation distances for the plants that you're saving is important. Okay, so I'm going to go into the differences between dry-seeded crops and wet-seeded crops, because there's two different seed-saving techniques for these. So dry-seeded crops are things that the seed actually matures after the plant is ready for eating and harvesting. So it will actually flower after you would eat it. The seeds actually dry on the plant, which is important to think about. They can be finished indoors, so you can harvest them and allow them to dry indoors later, but they're also very sensitive to moisture. So examples of this are things like lettuce, corn, wheat, beans, carrots, broccoli, onions, spinach, arugula. So all of these things they have to stay in the ground 2 or 3 times as long as you would grow them for actually eating. So lettuce, for example, takes us the entire growing season to produce lettuce seed on our farm. Rather, if you're going to eat it for a crop, you would probably eat it within 28 days. So just something to consider, that the time, and also when you harvest them, they're really sensitive to moisture once they produce seed, so you want to have them dry enough so that the seed doesn't get too wet once it's ready to harvest. For dry-seeded crops, harvesting and cleaning is pretty straightforward. The seed is usually harvested straight from the plant. It's brought indoors to dry. Then you have to do a process of threshing, because most dry-seeded crops, they have like a pod, like everyone has seen a bean pod. So most bean pods, they will dry on the outside and you have the seeds on the inside. Most seed crops are similar to that, and so you have to go through a process of crushing that outer pod, so you can stamp on it, you can have a dance party all over your seeds, or you can use mechanical threshing, separate the seeds from the pod, and then you can use wind or blowing them to get the pod off the seeds and separate the seeds from their chaff. Wet-seeded crops, in contrast, are processed and saved in a very different way. A lot of wet-seeded crops, you actually can harvest the seed at the same time as you would harvest the actual fruit, which is pretty cool. Some wet-seeded crops actually benefit from a little bit of fermentation. So, for example, tomatoes, cucumbers, and some melons actually benefit from fermentation. A very cool thing that happens is when you harvest wet seeded crops and you put them all in a bucket, so say for example you're harvesting all of these tomato seeds, you put all of this tomato pulp and seeds in a bucket, the viable seeds will actually sink to the bottom of the bucket, and the seeds that are not viable will actually float to the top. And so you can skim the seeds that, and when I say viable versus not, it's viable seeds will have a higher likelihood of germinating and producing fruit, whereas like the non-viable are usually lighter weight, they don't have a full germplasm on the inside, the potential of them producing actual fruit is much lower. So depending on what your objectives are, you might just want to save the seeds that sink and know that you're going to have good seeds. Then once you take the seeds out of their water, so you can use water and rinse them until they're free of pulp, and then dry them on like coffee filters or screens for multiple days until they're dry with fans and such. So examples of wet seeded crops are tomatoes, cucumbers, melons, winter squash, summer squash. Those are all kind of fall in the wet seeded crop category. So so as I kind of mentioned just previously, when you are harvesting wet seeded crops, you actually just pull everyone's seen well, I shouldn't say everyone, but most people have seen a tomato, and there's the seeds that are inside the tomato. You literally can just squish those seeds out and put them in some water and rinse them, and then you'll be able to dry them and use them. So same thing for melons. Other examples, so cucumbers, zucchinis, and winter squash, you actually let them stay on the vine a little bit longer than you normally would for eating. So cucumbers will actually go through this really weird growth stage where they actually kind of get bulbous and they turn white or yellow, and so they're kind of hard, and they almost start going soft before you're ready to harvest them. And this allows the seed to kind of get to a next level of ripeness that will improve its viability long term. Same thing with zucchinis. Like if you ever see, a lot of people have seen those like giant zucchinis that are so big, and people are like leaving them on your car seat, on your doorstep, and they're these giant zucchinis. People know what I'm talking about. And so those ones, you want to leave the zucchinis longer so that the seeds can fully develop. Cucumbers and tomatoes, they actually benefit from fermentation for a couple of days, and this actually breaks down a seed coat that's on a coat on the outside of the seed and allows it to have better germination long term. So you actually just like allow it to ferment in its own juices for 2 to 3 days, so it breaks down that seed coat. And then you strain them, you rinse them, and the viable seeds sink to the bottom, and the good ones float on the top. And you rinse them and you put them on some screens, and they can dry them. And it's pretty straightforward. Yeah, there's a lot more that I could tell you about, but I think people should just try and start saving seeds and doing the best that you can. There's a ton of resources out there. This is some of them that I like to recommend. There's a lot of great books. There's tons of stuff on YouTube. There's great organizations like CD Sudbury that's doing so much cool work in making seed saving accessible. So there's lots of resources in this community to reach out to. So I encourage you to do it and just try it. Bessie, miigwech, and thanks.